An EMP attack is a massive burst of electromagnetic energy from detonating a nuclear warhead high above you. But under international law, an EMP attack is not a nuclear attack and so is much more likely to occur. This podcast takes the position that ignorance of our enemy's EMP military doctrines, as well as a failure of U.S. strategic imagination, is setting America up for an EMP Pearl Harbor. When it strikes us, the EMP will collapse our power grid and SHAZAM. We're back in the Stone Age. 90% of us dead within a year. That is certainly what the head of the CIA believes. How can we prevent up to 90% of Americans dying within a year of a creative EMP attack by Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, ISIS, or any reasonably well-funded rogue state or actor? Find out on Amir Phillips, American Pragmatist.
Hey Amir, we've been talking about this at breakfast over at First Watch in Bentonville, and I gotta ask you, why is an EMP attack so imminent?
For the first time in history, small nations or even non-state actors can humble the most advanced nations on earth, such as ourselves, the United States, through an EMP attack.
When we discussed this podcast, I wanted to know the possibility of an EMP attack. And why is it so suddenly being discussed by militaries around the world?
An article in Military Thought, the flagship journal of the Russian General Staff, and I'll quote in the article here, the article is called "Weak Points of the U.S. Concept of Network-Centric Warfare Points to a Nuclear EMP Attack as a Means of Defeating the United States." And I'm going to read here the quote because it's a bit long. American forces may be vulnerable to electronic warfare attacks, in particular an electromagnetic pulse that is a brief, powerful electromagnetic field capable of overloading or destroying numerous electronic systems and high-tech microcircuits that are very sensitive to electromagnetic field, even transmitted from a distance. A single low-yield nuclear weapon exploded for this purpose high above the area of combat operations can generate an electromagnetic pulse covering a large area and destroying electronic equipment without loss of life that is caused by the blast or radiation. End quote.
Okay, let's back up for a second. What is an EMP?
I should have started that off in the first place. An EMP is an electromagnetic pulse, EMP. This type of attack is technically and operationally the easiest, least risky, and most effective use of a nuclear weapon available to a nuclear-armed state or non-state actor.
So any nuclear weapon can be used in an EMP attack?
Yes. Any nuclear weapon, even a primitive first-generation weapon like A-bombs that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, will produce gamma rays and fireballs that generate the high frequency, E1 EMP, medium frequency, E2 EMP, and low frequency, E3 EMP, electromagnetic pulses. An EMP attack delivers a threefold punch, E1, E2, E3, to electronics small and large, ranging from personal computers to our national electric grid and everything in between. It's catastrophic.
How is a nuclear EMP attack different from a nuclear strike?
Nuclear EMP attacks entails detonating the weapon at such high altitudes that no blast, thermal, fallout, or effects other than the EMP pulse are experienced on the ground.
Okay, so it stays high like a lightning, like super lightning, in that it never really touches the ground or anything like that. It's more like it delivers a shock that's really powerful against electronics.
Yes, except over a vast area. That's a good point.
Area instead of a pinpoint like lightning would hit just one spot.
Absolutely. Because EMP propagates in three waves, E1, E2, E3, their damaging effects will be dynamic and mutually reinforcing. The EMPs damages and destroys systems, including possibly lightning protection, for example, and that opens the door for a wider and deeper damage by E2 and E3 EMP.
So how many nuclear warheads are we talking about here in this proposed attack against the United States?
A single nuclear weapon can potentially make an EMP attack against a target the size of North America, but the United States, including Canada and Mexico, detonated at 4 40 kilometers altitude, the radius of an EMP field would be about 2,200 kilometers, so a pretty big range.
Wow. What's the most probable range and height of the attack?
Any nuclear weapon detonated in outer space, 30 kilometers or higher, will generate a high altitude electromagnetic pulse called a HEMP. That's not pot or marijuana. It's HEMP, the acronym, high altitude electronic pulse. And that damages all kinds of electronics, blacking out electric grids and collapsing other life-sustaining critical structures throughout the United States. I mean, it would be serious.
So to be clear, there's no blast, thermal, fallout, or effects other than a high altitude electromagnetic pulse, and they're experienced. There's nothing on the ground that we're experiencing. It's all in the atmosphere?
Yeah, that's correct. A nuclear detonation at 30 kilometers altitude will generate an EMP field with a radius on the ground of about 600 kilometers.
Wow, this is scary. What's the likelihood of an EMP attack happening here in the United States?
No, I mean, very high, very high. Since an EMP attack involves detonating a nuclear weapon at such high altitude that no blast kills humans, it's not viewed akin to nuclear war, i.e. a nuclear strike.
So it's not regarded as an act of war. Is that because it doesn't really attack humans? It attacks the electronics, so it's not considered the same kind of thing?
Yes, that's exactly right. And you're dead on, which is exactly why an attack of this nature is so likely to be used against us, because it's not going to be the equivalent of nuclear war or nuclear strike.
I have a hard time taking it seriously, considering the kind of countries that could even do something like this. We have economic relationships with, like, China. Everyone always says there's a threat from China, but we're China's biggest customer, and I feel like we owe them money. They want their money back. I don't see them killing us. It's not good business.
All right, fair point. But that kind of thinking's happened before. Let's go back in time a little bit. Those who opposed military preparedness before World Wars I and II used the same argument you're doing now, Jamie, that German aggression in World War was impossible because of the economic interdependence of European states in the world in the 30s. Economic interdependence did not stop the world wars from happening, nor did China's economic partnership with us stop a Chinese general during the 1996 Taiwan Straits crisis from actually threatening a nuclear strike against Los Angeles.
Wouldn't a country be a little weary about launching from their own land, considering it's probably really easy to trace back to, like, whoever sent that off, and then once that's known, we're just going to hit you harder with something else, right?
I mean, a common thinking, but the answer is no. The United States will be in no condition to retaliate. Russian open source military writings claim that super EMP weapons generate such powerful fields that even hardened U.S. strategic forces would be vulnerable. Massive conventional retaliation by the U.S., which you would expect, which could deter an attack, depends on the survival of our civilians, being able to fight back. And that wouldn't be the case. The damages electrical grid would probably, the destruction of that grid would probably preclude any kind of comeback.
Well, let's say it's not quite as bad as you're saying, and we are able to retaliate. Then we have the dilemma of trying to decide what kind of people we are, and do we want to hit them back with something equally as powerful in response to the EMP attack?
Well, okay, when I was speaking earlier, the retaliation, if it's non-nuclear, it's going to be less likely, and EMP targets electronics, not people, and would not immediately kill millions, to be clear, all right?
Okay.
Mass casualties would come later from secondary effects if the United States continues to be unprepared, which we are. So a retaliatory EMP strike on a nation like North Korea would be close to meaningless, since they're not as dependent as we are on advanced electronic infrastructures. Inflicting a nuclear holocaust on Tehran or Pyongyang for an EMP attack might not seem like a proportionate response to an American president, at least not immediately. So we can't hit them with the EMP because they're not electrical enough, and a nuclear counterstrike against North Korea for doing this or Tehran, it would look disproportionate. So yet again, this is why this amounts to increasing the odds of such an EMP attack. If we go nuclear, it looks too much because all they did was an EMP. If we respond in kind, they did an EMP, we do an EMP, they're not as electrical as us, they win.
Wow. Is anything else making an EMP attack more likely?
Yeah, unfortunately it is. It's the ripple effect of an EMP attack is hard to predict because until the full damage is done, which takes a while, the response is probably not going to be retaliatory in nuclear terms, but rather damage control. This also makes an attack more likely. Potential adversaries, they understand that millions could die from the long-term collateral effects of an EMP over like a year or two, and cyber attacks will be coming with it as well. And this causes a protracted blackout of our national electric grid and other life-sustaining critical infrastructures. It's all interconnected here.
So the lack of an initial boom on the ground and no real obvious damage on the ground or in the cities means a massive nuclear counter strike would seem sort of disproportionate to go back after them. Like in the world's eyes, they wouldn't think that was.
Oh yeah, I don't think the UN would be backing us up if we go if they do EMP and we go nuke. I think the UN abandons us. I think, and even U.S. citizens as well. This makes an EMP strike even more likely. There's no MAD here. By MAD I mean mutually assured destruction. So even our own citizens might, or a certain portion of them, say, they did an EMP, we can't do nuclear, but you could do an EMP back, and that may not be that effective if it's someone like North Korea who's not that wired into an electrical grid like we are.
So mutually assured destruction to counterbalance both opposing sides?
Yeah. That's that on precisely. Moreover, at least some militaries regard this relatively easy, potentially anonymous method of inflicting mass destruction. It's an attractive feature of what they call, quote, revolution in military affairs, end quote. And that's what's going on here. There is a revolution in military thinking worldwide in relation to this EMP attack.
So given that an EMP attack seems somewhat inevitable, what else, if anything, is going to accompany this attack?
Okay, I'm going to answer that this way. According to Russian General Slipchenko, an EMP, if combined with other modalities of warfare like cyber warfare and info sabotage, renders obsolete modern armies, navies, and air forces. So that's from a Russian general.
Do you agree that countries like North Korea are more likely to use this kind of an attack, and why?
EMP attacks are not easily signatured. And this post-attack anonymity makes an EMP attack by someone like North Korea more likely, as we're not going to be able to tell for sure who did it or even where it came from necessarily. Secondly, today, with one or a few ICBMs capable of inflicting a catastrophic EMP attack on the American people, a rogue state could recreate a MAD relationship, mutually assured destruction relationship, with the U.S., very much to the detriment of the United States. I mean, North Korea is now, through an EMP analysis, much more of our equal. We have a MAD relationship. We see ourselves as equal. But in my mind, this MAD relationship would be very unstable, since a first strike against a first world nation like the United States, which would be much more severe than against a second or third world nation like North Korea. We just can't hurt them with an EMP the way they can hurt us. It's that simple.
That's because we're living off the grid. We're living on the grid. We need it. It's part of our lives. It's everything, our food, everything's connected to the power that we get. And a first world country is so much more dependent on it. And if we got attacked that way, probably most of our population would die within a year.
Exactly. I mean, what makes us a first world country? The fact that we're so interconnected to internet, electricity, and that whole grid, and all our food and water is interconnected to that, is exactly which makes us so susceptible to an EMP strike. But a second and third world country like Iran or North Korea, they got a lot less to lose. They could survive with being off their national electric grid longer and better and more effectively than we could. That's a problem.
Earlier you said that there's no signature, and that means that there's no way to know who sent this. I think that's what that means. And aren't they using a nuclear warhead? Won't it be obvious who sent it?
Okay, rogue states or terrorists could make an anonymous EMP attack by launching a short or medium range missile off a freighter outside U.S. territorial waters, just having a freighter do it, off a freighter. This would eliminate the need for an ICBM to deliver the EMP attack. Since the EMP strike would come from no one's territory, international waters, it could also conceal the identity of the attacker. Although it would not be necessary, an additional layer of anonymity could be achieved by a state sponsor by contracting with terrorists to carry out the attack as a further level of cover.
Even so, I mean, it doesn't seem like a big, powerful country like the United States would be unprepared or vulnerable to something like this. I mean, I was mentioning earlier, I even saw in Red Dawn, the remake, they mentioned an EMP attack. So, I mean, it's in the zeitgeist, like we know about it. Why aren't we more prepared?
That's a good point. All right, I'm going to strike back with an article and take you on indirectly here. An article in the newspaper of the PLA, People Liberation's Army of Communist China, notes that, quote, the United States is more vulnerable than any other country in the world, end quote, to attack by EMP and combined armed cyber warfare. So, and I have a quote here from that article. It's a little long, so I've got to read this, okay? Some people might think things similar to the Pearl Harbor incident are unlikely to take place during the information age. Yet it could be regarded as the Pearl Harbor incident of the 21st century if a surprise attack is conducted against the enemy's crucial information systems of command, control, and communications by such means as the electronic warfare, electromagnetic pulse weapons, telecommunications interference and suppression, computer viruses, and if the enemy is deprived of the information it needs as a result. Even if a super military power like the United States, which possesses nuclear missiles and powerful armed forces, cannot guarantee its immunity. In their own words, a highly computerized open society like the United States is extremely vulnerable to electronic attacks from all sides. This is because the U.S. economy, from banks to telephone systems and from power plants to iron and steel works, relies entirely on computer networks. When a country grows increasingly powerful economically and technologically, it will become increasingly dependent on modern information systems. The United States is more vulnerable to attacks than any other country in the world. Close quote. That is from a Chinese military journal. I don't know how to be more clear than that.
Okay, so we know who the target is. It's us. So who can we expect to be the one that would strike us?
Well, despite what I just said about China, I'm going to start off with Iran. Iran, for one. EMP is most effective at blacking out critical infrastructures while it does not directly damage the environment and human life. And that's according to Iran's passive defense. Now, I have another quote here from Ambassador Woosley, one-time head of the CIA, and I'm quoting here. Because EMP destroys electronics directly, but people indirectly, it's regarded by some as Sharia-compliant use of a nuclear weapon. And so it comports with the Quran for Iran. In other words, Iran doesn't view doing an EMP strike is going against the Quran. So and that's very important. So they could attack us guiltlessly, okay? Passive defense and other Iranian military writings are well aware that nuclear EMP attacks is the most effective way of killing people. And I think, the rationale appears to be that people starve to death not because of EMP, but because they live on a materialistic society dependent upon modern technology. Now, I've got another quote here from Ambassador Henry Cooper, and he's former director of Strategic Defense Initiatives, and he's warned repeatedly that some Iranian satellite launches appear to be, they're practicing for making a nuclear EMP strike on the U.S. So,
wow, so basically Allah says, yeah, go ahead and do it. So does that mean they're going to be successful?
I don't know if Allah's going to make it successful for them, but if they think Allah's not against it, they're more likely to do it.
Are they the most likely country to attack us?
Despite everything I just said, probably not. If we're talking about effectiveness, not intentionality, intentionality would be more Iran and North Korea. But in terms of getting it done, probably not. It would be hands down Russia. Since Russia has super EMP weapons specialized for hemp attacks, high altitude EMP attacks, super EMP warheads have very low explosive yield, 10 kilotons or less, but very high gamma yield, which is what generates hemp. According to Russian military and technical sources, super EMP weapons can generate hemp fields of 100,000 volts per meter or higher, and that greatly exceeds the U.S. military hardening standard for hemp, which is 50,000 volts per meter. So they got more than double easily. So if they hit, the Russian hit is worse than any other hit.
I don't see Russia attacking us with an EMP, especially if we back off of this whole NATO defense thing. But what about them attacking the Ukraine? And if so, are they prepared to do a strike like that?
Like I said, in terms of intentionality, I think North Korea or Iran. In terms of effectiveness, Russia. But now I've got to counter-argue against myself. You raised a good point with Ukraine. Because Russia views they're fighting a civil war, because Ukraine is part of Russia, the heart of Russia. I mean, Russia started from Kiev 1,000 years ago. And also the Ukraine Republic that we see now is not the Ukraine historically, in the sense that Khrushchev added on a large component to the Ukraine. So Russia existentially feels it's fighting for its life in a civil war. If they use the Ukraine, if they lose it, NATO comes up right against them with nuclear weapons. That's not going to happen. So I think Russia's in the fight for the Ukraine for the finish. I honestly believe Russia's going to win the Ukrainian war. And what I mean by win, they're going to get largely what they want, and that, that's how that's going to pan out. If not, if for some reason not, would they fire an EMP to win that war, to prevent Ukraine from coming into NATO's orbit? I believe Russia would fire a hemp attack or a tactical nuke. That's how vested they are in this war. That is my opinion.
How would you do it?
Well, Russia has the technical capability to clandestinely orbit a nuclear-armed satellite or satellites to be maintained in orbit for years until needed to make a surprise hemp attack. So they can already do it. They've got satellites that have been circling for years that can do a hemp attack. So Russia uses, more specifically, hypersonic vehicles for a surprise hemp attack. They fly at about 500 to 100 kilometers in altitude, the optimum height of burst for super EMP warheads. Worse still, marriage of this NNEMP to drones or cruise missiles equipped with sensors to follow high-power electric lines and target control centers and transformers. That introduces yet another major threat to national power grids. The Russians have that kind of high altitude attack, that level of sophistication. It's serious if the Russians hit.
Are there any indicators to look for? Like, how do we know to expect an EMP attack? Is there anything that happens that we like a tilting of the hand, that we can see, a little tell?
In our everyday life, commonplace cyber theft, email disruptions, and hacking, we widely regard as annoyances, but they could foreshadow catastrophic nuclear hemp attacks on the grid that would threaten the existence of our society in the United States.
So cyber attacks, they're like a setup for something bigger, like an EMP attack. Makes me wonder, first of all, if there have been any attempts so far with some other country trying to send an EMP. But also, it kind of reminds me of Nazi Germany and the blitzkrieg strategy. Probing by their motorcycle corps and scout planes, looking for weaknesses, proceeded with mass onslaught of heavy armored division. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah. I mean, I didn't think we were going to go to the blitzkrieg, but yeah, that's fine. The blitzkrieg is a good analogy. They did use the motorcycle corps, to scout and feel things out, and it was disregarded. But it was the feeling out. They did show their hand, so to speak, as you said earlier. So the preliminary cyber attacks would be analogous to the use of Germany's motorcycle corps and scout planes before executing their blitzkrieg strikes. So yeah, I agree with you.
The cyber attacks are nothing new. I mean, we've been dealing with them for a long time. Do you think that that's sort of like a type of preparatory operation?
I'm gonna hedge my bet here and say definite possibility. Already from the perspective of adversary military doctrine on electronic warfare and cyber warfare, cyber thefts and intrusions look less like isolated cases of theft and hacking and more like probing U.S. defenses and gauging Washington's reactions perhaps in preparation for an all-out cyber offensive, and it would include physical sabotage, radio frequency weapons, and ultimately nuclear hemp attack.
What can we do to prevent all of this? One of the thoughts is I see maybe the next draft is that we have kids on computers.
More and more the military's got to focus on hacking and cyber warfare. It's going to be a lot more of that physically. If you lose the cyber warfare, the physical is going to be the mop-up, in my opinion. But to come back to your point on how do we prevent this, one crucial commonality is the widespread use of automated monitoring and control systems, which the Graham Commission has labeled as, quote, the ubiquitous robots of the modern age, known as supervisory control and data acquisition systems, known as SCADA, SCADA. These SCADA systems, along with digital control systems, DCS, and programmable logic controllers, PLC, have penetrated into every critical area of our nation's preparatory protocol. While these systems provide increased operational benefits and agility, they also increase vulnerability to an EMP attack, and that's critical.
How is that the case? How are these super advanced computer sensor systems somehow a massive liability?
Man, they're a massive liability because they're connected to the national grid. They're on the grid. The fact that these sensor systems like SCADA have frequently replaced manual controls both on-site and at remote locations is one of the crucial factors that have intensified the possibilities of cascading damages from E1, E2, E3 within and across the infrastructure sectors. If we had maintained manual control, that is not vulnerable to an EMP attack. We humans would not be overloaded by it. So we're kind of creating our own destruction there.
It reminds me in Star Wars where someone can just take a laser gun and shoot this massive door and it opens just because they hit the little device. It's like one little cause of chaos ruins like the entire Death Star. It's interesting. But if we get hit by an EMP attack, what happens after that?
Well, it's lights out, fallout. It's like when you get Luke Skywalker hits the right shot. If you get the right shot in the central nervous system, it's a knockout punch, and it's a good analogy to look at as a nervous system. Our national grid's our nervous system. We get knocked out, one hit, it's a knockout. An EMP could destroy much of the electrical grid within the United States because we have not, we haven't hardened it, so it would do that.
What's the largest vulnerability in our electrical grid?
The power transmission infrastructure is the weakness within the weaknesses that's, I think, a little more critical, and it would suffer significant damage under an EMP attack and is extremely, extremely difficult to repair.
Now I feel like we're in that scene where they're looking at the blueprint of the Death Star and they're figuring out exactly where to hit. Yeah. What exactly is this transmission grid composed of?
Substations and transformers that are power that step power up and down as power lines are switched in order to transfer high voltage, long distance power to a lower voltage, more suitable for consumer use. This grid is essential to maintaining electrical distribution if some power generation is lost, as this system can reroute electricity to where it's needed most. It's critical.
So then substations are exposed to both EMP and the elements while situated in remote areas.
Yeah. They're full of cables which can act like antennas, and they are dependent on telephone lines in order to function. Two high-value components of the transmission infrastructure, transformers and capacitors, are very hypersensitive to EMP attacks, EMPs.
So what within the grid would break down from one of the high EMPs, the hemp attack?
The combination of these factors, make it highly unlikely that U.S. substations will remain unscathed after a hemp attack or even an EMP attack, frankly. The equipment used in the transmission grid is super costly, specially produced, and has to be ordered from overseas before replacement here in the U.S.
Yeah, and I'd assume that those that have the expertise to replace the transformers and the capacitors, they'd be overwhelmed with how many things they need to fix, right?
Oh, totally overwhelmed. Yeah, especially if much of our infrastructure is damaged, and being overwhelmed would only delay the replacement of equipment that generally already takes 2 years to be manufactured and delivered from other countries.
So these are the specific deficiencies in our ability to replace our transmission infrastructure that must be addressed.
Yeah, yeah. In order to reduce the catastrophic effect of a successful EMP attack, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So in magnitude, are we talking like the New York City blackout of 1977?
Okay, I think that's a good example, maybe better than the Star Wars one, but it's a good one. All right, let's look at it. On July 13th, 1977, 2 lightning strikes caused overloading in the electric power substations at the Con Edison Power Company. These lightning strikes, the equivalent of a minuscule fraction of an EMP attack, caused the Indian Point power plant north of the city to fail, as well as the subsequent failure of the Long Island interconnection, which is a regional or larger synchronized frequency grid. Failure of the Linden Gothel's 230,000 volt interconnection with New Jersey resulted in the protective devices automatically removing from service overloaded lines, transformers, and cables.
Back then, we thought it was lightning, but now we know it was super lightning from some kind of unsignatured country. No, but as a result, the power failure throughout the New York City area, it caused, I mean, I'm from New York. Of course, I wasn't born when this happened, but that particular incident, it lasted, I think, an entire day, just one day. And just immediately, human beings went crazy, and there was mass looting. I remember hearing all about the shop windows being broken and stuff being stolen all over the place, and it was just mass chaos.
Yeah. In monetary terms, the estimated cost of the blackout was $346 million, and then nearly 3,000 people were arrested throughout just a 26-hour period. It was unbelievable.
Human beings constantly do this. Like when there's a breakdown in some kind of social order, then the animal side of us just comes out. And in this case, it was just one day. It brings into question any kind of like inherent goodness of man.
Yeah, I mean, sadly it does. Sadly it does. Had some instances like that with Katrina in New Orleans. But in this incident, the police were outmatched and had no chance of stopping massive theft. They had largely no choice but to stand by and watch the looters from a distance. In North Brooklyn, a community of more than 1 million residents, only 189 police officers were on duty. The New York City Police Department was completely overwhelmed.
Honestly, it just makes me think, like, are we only good because of laws? Are we only good because of the structure? And then when it's gone, the human side comes out. And then I'm thinking about myself first, and it's scary. I remember seeing the cover of this Time magazine that said Night of Terror. Yeah. And it's really eye-opening about what we're capable of.
And that night of terror, you say, is going to happen to us when, not if, in my opinion, not if. And after an EMP attack, cities will likely lose power for weeks, not 26 hours, and months. And the National Guard cannot occupy every major city, assuming it's able to mobilize at all.
Can you imagine months and weeks and years of that chaos? And in my mind, the evidence from that night in 1977 in New York kind of shows us like what would happen, and also like when the order and the rule of law without electricity, like what would happen to us? It's evidence.
In my opinion, we have less a sense of community throughout our country than in 1977. I mean, we simply like each other less these days, it seems to me.
Well, even when we're, people who care about human rights are trying to stand up for what they believe in, it still sometimes results in, violence and some chaos. We're learning a lot about humanity. Earlier, you're making a point, and you keep making this a point that this EMP attack is more of a when and not an if, which really scares me. And it's not just the nation, the government at risk, but it's the lives of everyday Americans, and people within a single year of this attack could be affected.
Oh yeah, I mean, most studies show it's anywhere from 60 to 90% of Americans are dead within a year. So all the credible evidence points in that direction.
Well, that's it for today. The inevitable EMP attack that turns America into the hit movie Zombieland is about to happen. So I'm quite terrified, and I want to know. I guess I have a question, Amir, about like what can an American president in the future, like the next president, be doing or start to plan? How can let me rephrase this. Hold on, I'm gonna pause. Amir, do you think that a president has any power or control over a situation like this?
Sure. Yeah, President Trump did try to harden the electrical grid of the United States. And in this instance, the military seemed to be working with him. The pushback came actually from electric companies around the country that frankly didn't want to give up control. Because when you harden the grid, the military has to take over. The military has to set the standards. Electric companies are utility companies that give us electricity, hopefully the most electricity at the cheapest price. We hope that's what they're doing. But when you say you need to harden your grid, they're going to say, what standard? Military standard. Who monitors that? Who makes sure it happens? The military has to take over, take power away from the electric utility companies across the country. And Trump was starting to do that to increase the hardening of our national electric grids. But he wasn't reelected, so that has died. And from my research, there's nothing the Biden administration has been doing at all in that regard. That seems to have just died, which is most unfortunate.
When something is that important, national security, and private sector companies are blocking it or stopping it, doesn't it feel like something's out of balance? And I guess my question would be, do you feel like this justifies some kind of nationalization of the power industry?
I mean, you're a libertarian, so I'm surprised you're even saying that. But
you deal with the military.
Well, yeah, I know it's true.
They're closer related than I thought.
Yeah, a fair point. And you saw during COVID, the military, martial law started coming into effect, that sort of thing. So, given that I believe it's a matter of when and not if, I'm willing to give the military some control in direct relation to hardening the electrical grid, and I'm about willing to do whatever it takes to get the grids hardened to get it up to standards to take a Russian hemp attack, high altitude EMP attack. If we could take that, we're good. We're good to go.
What would an EMP attack do against a nuclear power plant? It
automatically shuts down now. 20, 30 years ago, it would have been a lot worse. The rods were overheated and you would have had some real problems. And at Fukushima with the earthquake and the subsequent tidal wave, you had not an EMP attack, but a sudden attack that knocked out the electrical grid and it didn't have a good backup system. Now, it automatically shut down the higher end ones and they can go manual. So I don't think that would be a problem with the newer models of nuclear power plants.
Do you feel like this vulnerability should be considered a higher risk to American safety and maybe even something that people are talking about in the campaign coming up in a few years?
I think if they're not talking about it in the campaign, they are not focused adequately on our national security and they're not thinking creatively and innovatively the next war. All too often our generals and presidents and Americans in general, we fight the new war with the last war's thinking and methodologies, and that's why you lose. So,
also have a question about earlier you were quoting some publications from other countries that expose some of the vulnerabilities of this grid and some of America's security, and I'm just wondering, do you think that's a good idea for countries to be writing about that, where Americans can see, and vice versa? When our journalists write stories about what we're up to, that can't be good.
It's weird you say that, but it's always been true. The blitzkrieg, which you referred to earlier, the bulk of that came from Lytle Hart, who's a British military theoretician, and Rommel and a lot of the German generals learned him and read of him in military journals. So unless you're at war, you get some access to the military writings of others. And it's not a bad thing, because if we're not going to hate each other and fight wars, we kind of want to have some communication with each other so we can say, maybe we can work this out, guys. What about this? What about that? So it kind of leaves the door open. I know it sounds weird that we can read each other's military journals, but For everyone to be able to listen in to the scholarly discussion of other militaries is not necessarily a bad thing, but sometimes it can work out pretty ironically where the German generals, the blitzkrieg, actually came from a British military theorist, Lytle Hart. So,
also a random question about China. Like I understand that we've been in this sort of economic battle with China in competition mostly, in the free market with China. And something like this scares me because of how powerful they are. And honestly, they're probably a little bit scared of us at times about how powerful we are. Is there a scenario here where this is actually something we work together as allies against to protect the world from something like this happening, against maybe like some crazy Middle Eastern country or Russia or North Korea? Is it possible that China and the U.S. are aligned here?
I think to get an alignment like MAD, Maximally Assured Destruction, you want to have some alignment of interest. The first alignment of interest that's necessary is that we're both first world countries. The problem with Russia's not a first world country. So striking them with an EMP and striking us with an EMP, or them with a hemp and us with a hemp, we lose. The most advanced nation, the most electrical nation loses in an EMP attack. So to answer your question, I think China and the U.S. would be equally motivated if we're about equally connected. And I could give you another example, Western Europe. Let's say we were going to war against, England, France, Spain, Germany. Western Europe had a coalition of allies. Would they be motivated to work out a scenario like you just said? I would say yes. Why? Because we're about as equally connected to electricity, so we both have a vested interest in not blowing each other's heads off through an EMP attack. We could set up a MAD relationship, mutually assured destruction relationship, and we could work out what you're saying. So I'm going to throw the question right back at you. Do you think China is as connected to electricity as we are, and so are our interests aligned to do what you just suggested?
I think so. I learned from my friend Amir that not only are they as invested in power and in the using this kind of technology as we are, but there's more of them, and a lot of those people are starting to do a little better economically. And over the next 10 years, I think they're going to want more and more and more and more energy. Am I wrong?
They're going to want more and more and more energy. I don't think they're first world with us in electricity yet, so I don't think our interests are aligned right now. Unfortunately, in another 10 or 20 years, when they are ahead of us economically and ahead of us and much more connected to electricity in the national grid, what you're suggesting could come true. Unfortunately, if what you're suggesting does come true, then economically it means China's farther ahead of us because they're already about even with us now and they're not as connected to electricity. So they're more focused also on manufacturing. So if what you say does happen, it may be good in terms of EMP foreign policy, but very bad for America socioeconomically.
Well, listen, I have endless questions on this topic, but I'd love to hear, and I know Amir would love to hear your questions. So if you're listening to the podcast and you've just discovered what an EMP is, and maybe you're a little concerned or just have some ideas or questions, reach out.
This has been Amir Phillips, American Pragmatist. If you like the show, please hit like or subscribe. Also, it would be awesome if you went to the website, AmericanPragma.com. Any support there is greatly appreciated. Thank you so much.
Ignoring all of the remedies, believing all of the rumors, with their endless database. I wanna sit with my enemies and say we should have done this sooner, while I look them in the face. Maybe that will crack the case.
An electromagnetic pulse attack, EMP, is most effective at blacking out critical infrastructures while not directly damaging the environment or even harming human life. This makes it much more likely our enemies can justify to themselves its use against us. Yet we are not prepared for this somewhat inevitable attack. Experts agree on this on December 17, 2020, Admiral William Studeman, former director of NSA and former acting director of the CIA, open quote. I see little discussion anywhere of threats which integrate cyber and nuclear, all kinds including EMP, in both the offensive and defense. All these experts seem to stay in their vertical stovepipe fields of expertise and thinking. I think that cyber/information operations and nuclear integrated threats/vulnerabilities considered together need more and new thinking, close quote. So given the likelihood of an EMP attack and its attendant success, what would be the expected fallout for we Americans? An EMP strike can easily obliterate America's electrical, telecommunications, transportation, financial, food, and water infrastructures, rendering the U.S. helpless to coordinate actions and deliver services essential for daily life. Many of us have experienced the burdens of a short blackout, but we could not survive as a unified civil nation with the long-term loss of the electrical grid. The delivery of aid and restoration of order within the first week of an EMP attack will be crucial to prevent the permanent collapse of our cities. So what do we do? Measures must be adopted to ensure the resilience of the electrical grid and telecommunication systems, including developing limited redundancy and identifying means for the timely replacement of essential damaged parts or their rapid substitution. Hence, all parts needed for this redundancy must be made in America. We cannot wait for replacement parts at the discretion of the Chinese communists. Robust pre-disaster planning demands practical exercise that include top officials who rehearse a wide variety of contingency scenarios which would integrate federal, state, local, private sector, and non-governmental organizations. We must have backup systems to enable emergency broadcasts as well as interactive communications both within the U.S. and across the globe. It cannot be stated enough that redundancy in communications will be vital. Radio communications, for example, must be highly insulated from any EMP threat. The global scope of shortwave radio make it extremely likely that radio communications will be able to continue to function. Ham radios and other communication devices themselves may be destroyed, but the infrastructure itself is nearly invulnerable. Using shortwave radio for emergency broadcasts as well as interactive communications will be essential. In sum, an EMP attack coupled with cyber warfare and sabotage is by far the most likely means of structurally defeating the United States. Every American pragmatist must convey to our politicians that the time to institutionally prepare is now. More specifically, utilities should also be able to recover the cost for hardening their grid from an EMP attack. Having utility commissions raise rates, set rates that reimburse them for these costs is a must. These are in actuality opportunities to tie these investments to other modernizations that need to be done to the electrical grid, much of which is already aging and needs to be refurbished anyway. We need to act now, since the cost of not acting might very well be apocalyptic. You heard it here on Amir Phillips, American Pragmatist.